Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? To start with, we're seeing a massive increase in the US cases of coronavirus. We're also observing a similar slight increase in other countries. There has been a general global trend that goes downwards, but recent variations within specific countries are disconcerting. What we're finding is that despite that significant increase in the number of cases, the number of deaths is relatively flat. This has a fairly straightforward explanation behind it. The number of people who died initially were the most vulnerable. This means mostly the elderly or those with underlying medical conditions. This meant that they were already infirm, weak, or ill. The CCP virus simply added on an extra burden the body could not cope with, and as a result, they died. What we are now seeing with the expanding spread of the CCP virus is that those who are younger, healthier, and more likely to be able to survive, if they even have to worry about the disease itself, are being infected. This means more positive cases, but less death. This does not mean that we should be complacent about it. There is still a significant number of people who are likely to die from the CCP virus if they are infected, and infection is more likely with the larger number of people who have been infected. This creates something of a rather perpetual cycle, and it is not good. The idea is we need to get a hold of this now and reduce the number of people who are getting sick, even if they themselves are not going to die from the illness. The chances of someone who could die are still quite significant. Further to that, the number of people who would be hospitalized and thereby depriving others of necessary treatment or access to hospital services is another consideration. If you have a whole lot of people on respirators and taking up hospital beds, then you can't provide other services. In fact, there's something of an irony to the current situation. Anthony Fauci, who has been heavily criticized by the media for mixed messages and inconsistencies, described exactly this sort of situation about a year ago. His exact description of it was, as an infectious disease public health person, there are a lot of other things in society that I worry about, but you don't want my opinion of that. Let's talk about infectious diseases. Is a respiratory-borne illness that spreads rapidly, that's new. Mainly, there's no background immunity in the population, and that almost always turns out to be a brand new pandemic influenza. I do worry about that because when you have a respiratory illness that easily spreads and has a high degree of morbidity and some degree of mortality, you could have a public health catastrophe. This quote comes from just over a year ago. The prediction was almost spot on. And although we don't have influenza, we do have another coronavirus, which is related to influenza, and that is incredibly disconcerting. In fact, it's so prescient that Anthony Fauci has apologized to the person who was conducting the interview at the time. While still on the topic of the CCP virus, we do need to talk about a study coming out of Spain. The gist of this is that they don't believe that enough people are being infected simultaneously, and that the immunity gained from that infection is hanging around long enough for herd immunity to be viable based on a naturally occurring infection pattern. They think that about 5% of the people tested across the country had antibodies to the virus, and if you were to extrapolate this out to the wider population, that would mean a tiny fraction of people have actually been infected, an inverse to what you would hope to see for herd immunity. Normally you would want somewhere around the 95% mark for the population to generally resist an entrenchable disease like this, measles, and so on. Even among those who were tested, that 5%, a small fraction of those still had antibodies after they were tested weeks after infection. This means that not just 5% of people will be resistant to the CCP virus, but a fraction of the 5%. This could be a product of a series of issues. The first and simplest is, the more severe your immune reaction to the CCP virus, the longer you're going to retain resistance to it. Since most people are not developing an extreme reaction and having to fight the disease off, they're not developing that strong immunity. This is one reason why the bodies often give multiple doses of a vaccine. That stimulates it on multiple occasions, ensuring that it stockpiles the appropriate cells to fight it off later, thinking it's going to be a recurring issue. Even if we were to find a way to prompt that kind of immune response based on the current approaches available, not a vaccine but something like serum treatment to get a better reaction from people who have been infected by the CCP virus, it's estimated we would need at least 60% of the population to have that immunity in order to reach herd immunity levels. And at a fraction of 5%, we are nowhere near that. The consequences of the CCP virus go beyond simply how hard it is to treat, and research is piling up that there are a lot of long-term and likely to be chronic issues with the CCP virus after you've recovered. At least one of these should be more concerning than just lung damage. It's damage to the brain. There has been indications that there are neurological symptoms associated with the CCP virus, and we're now looking at studies that are showing just this sort of damage. Unlike lung damage and other heart damage, which can be worked around to some extent through training, exercise, and other physical activity to improve capacity of those organs, once the brain is damaged, it is permanently damaged, and there is very little to be done about it. What's more is we're now seeing that these symptoms may be showing up in individuals who are not experiencing severe cases of the CCP virus. This means that spectrum of individuals, and particularly that sudden and severe rise in younger people being infected, could lead to a wide swath of brain damage in the wider population. This is not the only form of brain damage that could be happening. There are issues with encephalitis or swelling of the brain. There are also issues with blood clotting and then strokes following this. It looks like the CCP virus could be linked to a range of brain damaging disorders in the future, and it will be worrying to know just what kind of impact it might have, especially when you have young people engaging in reckless behavior that puts them at unnecessary risk of exposure, such as those in Alabama we mentioned last week. In the final piece of CCP-related news, the Trump administration has set a date to end their relationship with the World Health Organization. This primarily relates to its handling of the CCP virus. This severance of their relationship, and effectively a divorce, is going to have a series of effects. The first is simply that they're going to no longer be funding the World Health Organization, and the US has been one of the largest funders of the World Health Organization. This has an effect on other things as well. It's worth bearing in mind throughout this bit of the video that the World Health Organization does not necessarily provide direct aid itself. Rather, it acts as a point of coordination between the different countries. One of the roles they play is in development of the annual flu vaccine. They work by collaborating with several other countries that have monitoring programs. They gather all the information, create a statistical model. They then come together, look at the statistical model, and the countries involved then vote on which of the vaccine strains to use. This is done several years in advance of the vaccines being made, as it takes up to a year to create and stockpile enough. That means, at least for now, the US may not need to worry about the implications of having left the World Health Organization. This is because they will already have chosen their vaccine for the current year, the next year, and possibly the year after. This is further complicated by the way that the World Health Organization in general is set up. Countries contribute money towards it. The World Health Organization then disseminates this money as it sees fit. This has been heavily criticized by both the Trump administration and by outside sources. Even within the World Health Organization, there has been criticism of the fact that the very department responsible for monitoring and handling these sorts of events, pandemics in general, has been grossly underfunded and understaffed for quite a while now, and this has led to its issues in dealing with the outbreak and pandemic. This does somewhat mitigate the claims made by a variety of health experts that withdrawing from the World Health Organization is likely to create a problem, especially when it comes to programs that monitor these sorts of events. If they were already drastically underfunded and understaffed, the America's withdrawal could have implications if the money was there in the first place. While on the topic of medical developments, let's look at a synthetic or prosthetic development. There's an artificial cartilage that has been developed that is strong enough to work as a knee joint. At the moment, most synthetic or artificial knees used as a prosthesis are made out of a metal. They can rub together and gradually wear out over time. Now, with any luck, any prosthetic used would hopefully last for many years, but gradually it would need to be replaced. There has been a lot of work towards developing alternatives that would work like the normally naturally occurring cartilage in the knee joint, and in fact in other joints. Recently, chemists at Duke University have developed just such a hydrogel. Each year, there's nearly 1 million knee replacements conducted in the US. This number increases drastically when you account for other countries, and the aging population in most Western countries. They require invasive surgery, and implications of this can leave someone debilitated for life if something goes wrong or if they require multiple replacements. This is because the surgery requires removing part of the bone and replacing it with that steel or metal version. If you could only replace the cartilage itself, then that removes a lot of this problem. The bone itself is still there, and it mitigates the need for as invasive and destructive surgery. In medical news, China has issued a warning after it has identified a case of bubonic plague. According to reports coming out of northern China, at least one case of bubonic plague, otherwise known as Black Death, has been identified in Inner Mongolia. This is an autonomous region in northern China, which is supposed to be self-managing. If you are familiar with history, then you would know that bubonic plague, or the Black Death, spreads readily throughout people, and this is a concern that it might turn into another epidemic. The government has tried to do something about this by implementing a number of restrictions, one of which is hunting wild animals that might carry it. The other is reporting illnesses and so on. The concern is simply this, that although it is treatable, it is highly transmittable, and if enough people are infected, it could outcompete the capacity of the medical system to treat them. Next, we have a continuation of the ever-growing and ever more scary 2020 events. In this case, identification of a deadly amoeba in Florida. This amoeba is called Naegleria fowleri. It is an amoeba that can cause infection of the brain. This then leads to encephalitis. Encephalitis causes brain tissue to become damaged and possibly destroyed. Unfortunately, it is also generally fatal. Fortunately, it hasn't been a very common disease, with only 37 cases since 1962 and about 143 documented cases across the US. The problem is where it's located, which is in generally a large population center, including Tampa and other cities. The best advice with this at the moment is to avoid unnecessary access with water. Going from the more terrifying to something interesting and somewhat useful, researchers have found a way to finally modify the mitochondrial DNA. Understand, the mitochondrial DNA is distinct from the normal DNA you would think of. Mitochondrial DNA is housed within the mitochondria, and it's generally an inherited DNA strand. It is involved in structures around metabolism, how the mitochondria works, and so on. It has generally been impossible to modify this DNA to the exception of other DNA simply because of where it is and how it is. The membrane of the mitochondria is incredibly selective in what it lets in and what it lets out. This is because of what's within it. inside the mitochondria, there are many enzymes and things that could cause harm to the cell. If they could freely move in and out, they could cause a lot of damage. By contrast, the cell's nucleus is far more hospitable. When you combine this with our technology to date that has largely been only able to work on single strands of DNA, the mitochondria was simply too difficult to access and modify. Through the combination of a variety of enzymes, CRISPR technology, and a modified older technique, they were able to begin targeting what was in the mitochondria. Now, this is very early stages, but what they could do was have an even chance of modifying the genome of the mitochondria. That means there's a 50% chance that what they're trying to do would work. Now, that in and of itself isn't particularly great, but it's how specific that chance was. It was going to be a 50% chance that they would make a modification to their desired target, or they would make no modification at all. This level of precision is desirable and in fact impressive. As with other genetic modification technology, there's a possibility of using this for treating various inherited disorders. There are a number of them that are associated with the mitochondria. These regard muscle growth, energy levels, metabolism, and so on. If we have a technology available to modify the mitochondria, it is possible that people could be treated for inherited disorders affecting these. While on the topic of things that are changing, we've known for a while now that Earth's magnetic field should be switching the poles around, so what was the North Pole will become the South Pole. This is thought to occur on a reasonably predictable schedule of every few 100,000 years. What we thought would take a long time, that being centuries if not possibly millennia, is now occurring far quicker than previously thought, at up to 10 times the expected speed. It was thought that it would move at roughly 1 degree a year, but it's now thought that it may be moving up to 10 degrees a year. Next we have a novel discovery in mathematics, and possibly a new way to solve quadratic equations. The normal method for solving a quadratic equation is to try and find what fits into B and then figure this out for the final solution. This is basically a plug-and-play question. The alternative has always been things like graphing it, using a variety of other tools, and just nightmarishly working your way through these questions. Now, that's going to work and has always been taught, but what the discoverer of this new method has thought of is, what about if you use the average? That is, he takes the various factors that are involved, allows them to work as 1 plus the unknown and 1 minus the unknown, and he allows the unknown to be equal to 0. This means he can figure out what will fit in there in the best way possible. His work itself isn't particularly difficult to apply, and that's the big thing here. And he also wondered why his method, which was so simple, hadn't really been taught in schools or in textbooks or in fact in any English source. Well, after his work, which you can see here, was put on a preprint server, people began notifying him that it had been taught in other languages. He's also humble enough to admit that he's certain that if he has discovered it, surely someone else in the last 4,000 years would have also made that same discovery. Ultimately, his work currently needs to be proofed and may wind up modifying what is taught in textbooks for mathematics. While on the topic of novel discoveries, an entire new genus of trapdoor spider has been defined within Australia. Generally speaking, defining a species can occur a number of ways, whether that is morphology, which we've touched on previously, or in behaviour, which we've described in less detail. In this case, the trapdoor spiders are often defined by the way they create their burrow, and in Australia there were 2 that were being looked at. One of these behaviours is whether they create their trapdoor as a plug door or as a palisade burrow. The plug door is nearly unnoticeable from the surrounding environment when it's closed. The palisade burrow, on the other hand, is noticeable as you can see it rising above the soil. What you then have is a possible third type of trapdoor, This is known as the whopperdor. Its design and nature are different to that of the other spiders, and until recently there was only thought to be one example of spiders creating this sort of structure. After discovering 17 more, they now need to redefine the genus and put these 18 spiders into their appropriate group. While on the topic of things that are unpleasant and animal or bug-like, that locust plague we've been mentioning, it's getting worse and affecting a larger area than before. So far, it's hit China, India, Pakistan, and most of Eastern Africa. In combination with the pandemic, there's a lot of problems facing these regions that have been hit. The locust plagues are going to be destroying fields full of food and fodder. That means there'll be a lack of food for people and animals, which means there'll be an even greater shortage of food for humans overall. This is going to lead to massive economic fallout and possibly social destabilization. Farmers are dealing with this with what could be considered a very blunt tool. They are simply dropping pesticide over large regions of farmland. This is done in an effort to preserve what they can right now. Unfortunately, simply indiscriminately dropping pesticide over large areas is going to have an effect on both human health and the biodiversity of those regions. A more effective and probably long-term plan is required to deal with these issues. We should also mention another thing that has come out recently, and that is a letter signed by a number of high-flying individuals, whether they are authors, researchers, or celebrities. In short, it says that stifling free speech is dangerous and bad. Unfortunately, this same letter that has been signed by more than 150 individuals of high standing has been received in a rather mixed way. Some people have supported it, others have viewed it as promoting hatred of various kinds. The fact is, some of the names signing off on this have large platforms, and they're unlikely to lose them anytime soon. But the fact is, they're doing their part in stepping up and telling the world, we support the idea of people sharing information, trying to communicate, and then understanding what is happening. The letter summarizes their whole position with this simple quote: "The way to defeat bad ideas is by exposure, argument, and persuasion, not by trying to silence or wish them away." While talking about publishing of a sort, there's a series of articles that have come out from Retraction Watch that are worth mentioning at the end of this video. One of these is about an attempt by a publisher to try and get more people who are underprivileged, mostly from developing countries, publishing in their journals. They set up what you could call a team. Their role was to try and figure out ways to get this happening in a special issue. What they found, at least from their point of view, is that the special issue was focusing on too many first world problems. This led to the team involved resigning, and the journal itself looking to investigate just what exactly has happened after it was publicly shamed. And finally, another retraction article. This is all about an article that was retracted for its title, "Where there are girls, there are cats." The Biological Conversation, the journal where it was published, retracted this paper, calling it controversial. They've now republished it with a new title, "Understanding How Free-Ranging Cats Interact with Humans, a Case Study in China with Management Implications." A far less catchy name. Why did this happen? It was due to outcry. For some reason, the name elicited an unpleasant result. But what they found, and to quote the study, "We found, as expected, the density of feeding stations is positively associated to the density of free-ranging cats. More interestingly, the density of male students versus female students seemed to be non-randomly associated with the distribution of cats among the universities. An online questionnaire confirmed that women were more concerned about the living conditions of free-ranging cats than men in China." It would seem that the original title, and even allowing for the language barriers from the original authors, is consistent with what they've found. The offense taken at it does not seem to be as well justified as to retract the article, but that's what the journal did, and it has been republished, along with a series of other documents. This includes the notice of temporary removal, the new paper, and an editorial. That's a lot of reaction to a otherwise harmless and accurate title that is far more eye-catching than what has been put in its place. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.